On the 20th of July, 2026, the Russian Baltic Fleet frigate Neustrashimy fired live rounds 40 miles south of Plymouth, in the middle of one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. HMS Tyne, the shadowing British vessel, could do nothing but watch. It was a calculated provocation, a measured demonstration that a foreign warship could exercise lethal capability in home waters while the Royal Navy stood off at a distance. The images made headlines. Politicians asked questions. Defense correspondents reached for dramatic language. They might have saved themselves some effort and looked at the history books. Because the Royal Navy has been here before. Not in disputed waters far from home, not in some ambiguous grey zone of international law, but in the Dover Strait itself, in the dead of night, in wartime. In under an hour, in the early hours of the 27th of October, 1916, German destroyers tore through the Channel Patrol and sank 6 British vessels before disappearing back into the dark. The Admiralty did not hold a press conference. They buried the report, restructured the entire Channel defense, and quietly hoped nobody would ask too many questions. This is what actually happened. By the autumn of 1916, the Dover Strait had become one of the most strategically critical 21 miles of water on Earth. The Western Front had been bleeding both sides white since the summer. The British Expeditionary Force required a continuous flow of men, ammunition, food, and fuel across the Channel, every day, without interruption. The Strait was the artery. Control it, and you controlled the lifeline of the entire British war effort on the continent. The Germans understood this perfectly. Their high seas fleet had met the Grand Fleet at Jutland in May 1916 and, despite inflicting heavier casualties on the British, had retreated to port and largely remained there. The war at sea had shifted to a different register, submarines operating against merchant shipping, and far surface raiding forces probing the Channel defences for weakness. The Dover Patrol, a British command established specifically to hold the strait, was responsible for maintaining anti-submarine nets and minefields across the Strait of Dover, protecting the cross-channel supply lines, and intercepting any German surface forces bold enough to attempt a passage. On paper, the British position looked robust. The Dover Patrol operated a substantial force of destroyers, torpedo boats, drifters, and other patrol craft operating out of Dover and Dunkirk. The strait was crossed by deep minefields and indicator nets designed to catch submarines. A line of drifters, small fishing vessels converted to naval use, maintained a continuous patrol across the strait, watching the nets and reporting any disturbance. The Admiralty had invested considerable resource in this system. Intelligence suggested the Germans were planning surface operations against the strait, but the warning had not translated into effective readiness. The patrol dispositions on the night of 26 to the 27th of October, 1916 left the drifter line thinly covered and the destroyer supported insufficient readiness to respond quickly to a fast night attack. The Germans had done their reconnaissance. They knew the pattern of British patrols. They knew the drifters were slow, lightly armed, and entirely incapable of defending themselves against a destroyer. And they knew that if a raiding force moved fast enough through the darkness, it could be in, through, and out again before any British response could be mounted. On paper, the British patrol craft arrayed across the Dover Strait that night outnumbered the attacking force. On paper, home waters, established patrol lines, and proximity to the Royal Navy's bases at Dover and Dunkirk should have meant the Germans were sailing into a trap. On paper, 6 weeks of intelligence warnings about probable German surface action in the Channel should have produced a state of heightened alert across every vessel on station. None of that, as it turned out, meant very much in the dark at 25 knots. What the Germans had and the British lacked that night was not firepower on paper. It was cohesion, preparation, and the willingness to accept that a defense which looks adequate on a chart is not the same as a defense that functions under contact. The German raiding force, 2 flotillas of destroyers, had been specifically planned and briefed for this operation. They knew their targets. They knew the geometry of the patrol line. They moved with a clear mission and clear command. Speed and surprise were the whole plan, and the whole plan was built around executing those two things before the British response mechanism could engage. The British drifter line, by contrast, was exactly what its name suggested, a line of slow, lightly built fishing craft, each crewed by a handful of men, spread across miles of dark water, maintaining watch on anti-submarine nets. They were not fighting vessels in any meaningful sense against a destroyer. They carried small armament. They could not maneuver to avoid attack. They could transmit a warning, but only if they survived long enough to do so, and a German destroyer closing at speed in the dark of an autumn night in the Channel gave very little warning time. The C-class destroyer HMS Flirt had been launched at Jarrow on the 15th of May, 1897, nearly 2 decades before the war began. She was old by the standards of 1916. The C-class had been the Royal Navy's workhorse light destroyer of the late Victorian and Edwardian period, competent vessels in their time, now pressed into patrol and escort work in home waters because the newer, faster destroyers were needed for fleet service with the Grand Fleet in the north. She was not a modern fighting ship. She was a patrol vessel, doing patrol work, in a strait that was supposed to be defended by the system around her rather than by her own fighting capability alone. HMS Nubian was in a different category, a tribal-class destroyer, newer and more capable, operating in the same general theatre. The tribal class had been built to a higher specification, with heavier armament and greater speed. But as the night of 26 to the 27th of October, 1916 would demonstrate, being the more capable ship in the wrong position at the wrong moment solved very little. The central failure was systemic, not individual. No single commander on the British side was uniquely culpable for what happened. The patrol dispositions had been approved up the chain. The readiness dates had been set by the command. The assumption embedded in the system was that the net and drifter barrier, combined with the presence of destroyer forces in the area, was adequate deterrence. That assumption had not been tested under realistic night raid conditions. On the night the Germans finally tested it, the assumption collapsed almost immediately. The drifters could see almost nothing. The destroyers could hear nothing useful above their own engine noise when at speed. Communication between units was slow. The German flotillas moved through the darkness with the enormous tactical advantage of knowing exactly what they were about to do, while every British vessel they encountered was reacting from a standing start. That is the hidden anatomy of the disaster, not inferior ships, not cowardly men, but a system optimized for the threat it expected and entirely unprepared for the threat it received. If accounts of how the Channel's defenses were built, broken, and rebuilt again are the kind of history that holds your attention, subscribing to this channel means you will not miss what comes next. The German raid developed across a wide front. The two flotillas approached the drifter line from the northeast in the early hours of the 27th of October, 1916, moving at high speed under cover of darkness. The autumn night provided no moon to speak of, and visibility in the Channel at that hour was limited. The drifters on the net line had almost no warning before the German destroyers were among them. The attack was swift and brutal. The drifters were overwhelmed. They could neither escape nor effectively resist. German gunfire and torpedo attack accounted for vessel after vessel along the patrol line. The British losses mounted with terrible speed. 6 vessels sunk in the course of the raid, which unfolded over less than an hour from first contact to the German withdrawal. HMS Flirt, the old C-class destroyer launched in 1897 at Jarrow, was among those sunk. She went down on the 27th of October, 1916 in the Dover Strait, 19 years of service ending in the darkness of a night action she had not been built to survive. The circumstances of her sinking reflected the broader pattern of the engagement, a vessel caught without adequate support, unable to bring her limited capability to bear decisively before she was overwhelmed. HMS Nubian, the tribal-class destroyer operating in the same waters, was hit during the action. The damage she sustained was severe and of a distinctly particular kind. Her bows were blown off. She did not sink, but she was reduced to a truncated, bowless hull, no longer a functioning warship. The loss of her forward section was as complete as any damage short of total destruction. She was taken in tow and removed from the battle area, but her fighting career as HMS Nubian was effectively over. The German flotillas completed their run through the patrol area and withdrew. British destroyer forces attempted to respond, but the speed of the raid and the darkness of the night meant that coherent pursuit was not possible before the German vessels had opened sufficient distance. The attackers escaped largely intact. The patrol line they had torn through was shattered. The total British losses across the action were 6 vessels. Against that, the Germans suffered no comparable loss. It was, by any measure of a single night's fighting in home waters, a serious defeat. The patrol system that the Admiralty had trusted to hold the channel had been tested under realistic conditions and had failed to hold it. The immediate British response was to suppress the scale of what had happened. The Admiralty's handling of the news from the Dover Strait on the 27th of October, 1916 was, in the bluntest terms, a controlled burial. In wartime, operational security provided a legitimate cover for restricting information, and the Admiralty used that cover. The loss of 6 vessels in a single night's raiding action in home waters, the Channel, not the North Atlantic, not the Dardanelles, was not material that the naval staff wished to see discussed openly. The public was told very little. The full picture was not allowed to circulate. Internally, the consequences were more substantive. The raid forced a fundamental reassessment of Dover patrol doctrine and dispositions. The system of drifters on net lines with destroyers in readiness nearby was examined and found wanting at its root. The readiness states were tightened. Patrol dispositions were revised. The response time for destroyer support to the drifter line was addressed. The whole architecture of channel defense was reviewed and rebuilt on the basis of what the German raid had actually demonstrated, rather than what the previous theoretical assessment had assumed. The repair of HMS Nubian produced one of the more distinctive solutions to material loss in the entire war. Her bows had been blown off, but the forward sections of another tribal-class destroyer, HMS Zulu, had also been damaged in a separate action, leaving Zulu as a functioning bow attached to a destroyed midships and stern. The solution was logical and, in execution, elegant. Nubian's intact midships and stern sections were joined to Zulu's intact bow. The resulting vessel, a working destroyer assembled from the surviving halves of 2 wrecks, was commissioned into service as HMS Zubian. She served until the end of the war. The name was not whimsy. It was a precise description of what she was, a ship made from the wreckage of Zulu and Nubian, stitched together and sent back into the channel that had destroyed both her predecessors. That piece of improvisation stood as a small, functional monument to what the Dover Patrol had learned in the hardest possible school. When the system breaks, you work with what you have. You do not wait for ideal conditions. You put the joined vessel back in the water and you close the gap in the line. The German raid of October 1916 did not, in the end, break the channel supply lines. The Western Front continued to be fed. The cross-channel passage of troops and material was disrupted for a period but not severed. In the strictly operational sense, the attack achieved local tactical success without translating it into strategic collapse, partly because the British response, however belated and painful, was real. The rebuilding of the Dover Patrol's defensive system in the months following the raid produced a more resilient and better resourced barrier. Subsequent German attempts to repeat the action faced a different environment. But the October 1916 raid remained, for those who knew what had actually happened, a demonstration of a principle that the Royal Navy has been slow to absorb in almost every generation: a defense that exists on paper and a defense that holds under contact are not the same thing. The drifter line looked adequate. The patrol dispositions looked adequate. The readiness of support forces looked adequate. None of it was adequate when 25 knots of German destroyer came through the darkness with a clear plan and no hesitation. The men who crewed HMS Flirt on the night of the 27th of October, 1916 did not fail. The old C-class destroyer from the Jarrow slipway, 19 years in service by the time the Germans found her in the dark, was in the wrong place inside a broken system. What failed was the assumption that a system designed against an expected threat would hold against an unexpected one. The Admiralty learned that lesson, quietly, in the months after the raid. They rebuilt accordingly. And then, as institutions do, they filed the lesson away. On the 20th of July, 2026, a Russian frigate fired live weapons in the channel while the watching British vessel held its distance. The new Strasham's 30-minute gunnery exercise 40 miles south of Plymouth was not an act of war. But it was a pointed illustration of the same underlying principle the Dover Strait demonstrated in 1916, that present on a chart and effective control of a stretch of water are different claims, and the difference becomes visible the moment someone decides to test it. HMS Flirt had been launched in 1897. She had served 19 years. She went down in the Dover Strait on the 27th of October, 1916, in the dark, in under an hour, because the system she served had not been built to handle the test it actually received. The old destroyer from Jarrow did not go quietly. But the channel did not hold that night. And nobody talked about it for a very long time. Thank you for watching. If this account of the Dover Patrol is the kind of naval history you want more of, please subscribe and turn on notifications. The next ship story is already in the works.